Part 1. The Relief Posting. My name is Callum, and I spent 11 days as relief keeper at the Saltmere Light before the supply boat came back early and found me on the rocks below the tower, half drowned, unable to explain to anyone's satisfaction how I'd gotten there or what had happened to the man I was supposed to be relieving. I've had 8 months since then to put this account into some kind of order, and I'm posting it now because the official maritime inquiry closed without an explanation, because Edmund Farrow's family deserves better than a shrug and a line in a Coast Guard file, and because I don't think I'm the last person who's ever going to be offered that posting. Saltmere Light sits on a spit of rock 9 miles off a stretch of coastline too rough and too poorly charted for regular boat traffic, automated since the 1980s in every technical sense, except that the Maritime Trust that maintains it has kept a human keeper on-site year-round for reasons nobody in the modern administration could ever quite explain to me when I asked. I took the relief posting for the money, mostly. A month's isolated pay is considerable, and I was between jobs and between most other things in my life at the time, the kind of unmoored circumstance that makes a remote lighthouse sound less like a hardship and more like exactly what a person in my position was looking for. I'd spent the 2 years before that posting drifting between short-term contract work, a relationship that had ended badly enough that I'd stopped mentioning it to anyone who hadn't already lived through the aftermath with me, and a general sense that my life had become a series of waiting rooms between one uncertain thing and the next. A month of total isolation, paid well, sounded, if anything, like a relief. I did some cursory research before accepting, the way anyone reasonably cautious would. Searched the Trust's public materials, found a handful of old newspaper features about the tower's history dating back to its original construction in 1887. Replaced twice since after storm damage but maintaining, according to every source I found, an unbroken record of continuous keeper staffing that the articles treated as a charming historical curiosity rather than anything requiring further explanation. One older piece from a regional heritage magazine some 20 years back quoted a retired keeper describing the posting as solitary but never lonely, if you understand the difference, a line I found faintly poetic at the time and have since come to understand rather differently. Edmund Farrow had kept that light for 6 years before I arrived to cover his scheduled leave, and everything I knew about him going in came from a single handover call with the Trust's regional coordinator, a tired-sounding woman named Petra Voss who told me Edmund was very particular about his logbook, and that I should simply follow whatever routines he'd left documented rather than improvising my own. I didn't think much of that instruction at the time. I've thought about almost nothing else since. The supply boat dropped me at Saltmere on a gray Tuesday morning, and I remember the specific disappointment of the handover itself. I'd expected, I suppose, some proper overlap period, a day or two of Edmund walking me through the tower's actual operation before he left on the same boat that brought me. Instead, he was waiting at the dock already packed, already restless in a way that struck me even then as more than ordinary eagerness to get off an isolated rock after 6 years. He was thinner than the one photograph I'd seen of him in the Trust's records suggested, hollowed out around the eyes in the specific way people get after too many nights of interrupted sleep, and he kept glancing past me, toward the water beyond the boat, even while we spoke, as though some part of him were still standing watch even in the act of leaving. He shook my hand, showed me where the logbook was kept in a locked drawer in the watch room, gave me a brisk, efficient tour of the fuel stores and the radio equipment and the small kitchen stocked with a month's provisions, all of it delivered in the clipped, professional cadence of a man reciting a checklist he'd given many times before to inspectors and officials, not the warm, personal handover I'd half expected between two people about to share the strange intimacy of the same isolated posting. Then, at the very end, standing on the dock with his single bag already over his shoulder and the boat's engine idling behind him, his voice changed, dropped into something quieter, more urgent, closer to how a person speaks when they've decided, at the last possible second, that formality isn't going to be enough. "There are 3 things I need you to actually hear, not just nod along to," he said. "Win the mechanism by hand if the automation ever fails. Don't wait for a service call. Log every light you see on the water after dark, no matter how ordinary it looks. And don't go down to the tide pools on the east side after the light's lit for the night, whatever you think you're seeing down there." I laughed, a little, the way you do at a piece of advice that sounds like exactly the kind of theatrical warning an isolated keeper might enjoy handing off to make his replacement's first night a little more colorful. Edmund did not laugh with me. He looked at me for a long moment, the specific look of a man deciding whether it was even worth trying to say more, weighing, I understood only much later, whether burdening a stranger with the full truth on his very last morning at that posting was a kindness or simply a cruelty dressed up as honesty. Whatever he decided, he said nothing further. He got on the boat, and I never saw him again, and neither, as far as I've been able to determine, has anyone else. Part 2. The logbook. The tower itself was smaller than I had expected from photographs. A narrow, whitewashed cylinder rising maybe 90 feet above the rock. A keeper's cottage attached at its base, both structures worn thin by decades of salt wind in a way that made the whole place feel less like a building and more like something the sea had simply agreed, for now, not to finish reclaiming. I spent that first afternoon doing what any relief keeper would do, familiarizing myself with the automated lamp mechanism, checking the fuel reserves for the backup generator, walking the narrow catwalk that circled the lamp room and looking out at 9 miles of empty gray water in every direction. The isolation, that first afternoon, felt less like the oppressive thing I'd half-braced for and more like a genuine relief. A stillness I hadn't experienced in longer than I could easily remember. The kind of quiet that made the ordinary noise of my own life on the mainland feel, in retrospect, exhausting in ways I hadn't fully registered until it stopped. It was the logbook that actually unsettled me first, more than anything about the tower or the isolation itself. Edmund had kept it exactly as promised. In a locked drawer I found the key for tucked behind a loose board Petrovas had mentioned over the phone, and the entries, going back the full 6 years of his posting, were meticulous in a way that went well beyond any operational requirement I could identify. Weather, obviously. Lamp maintenance, obviously. But also, on nearly every page, a separate column, headed simply Lights Observed, logging what appeared to be sightings of other lights on the water after dark. Vessel running lights, presumably, the kind of thing any keeper might note in passing, except that Edmund's entries included details no ordinary passing vessel sighting should have required. Exact count of lights, their relative spacing, whether they moved in formation or independently, and, disturbingly often, whether they had answered the tower's own light in some pattern he never fully defined in writing. I sat at the small desk in the watch room for the better part of 2 hours that first evening, working backward through years of those entries, and I want to describe the specific quality of dread that built, reading them in sequence rather than encountering them piecemeal, because I think the sequence itself was the thing that first genuinely frightened me. Edmund's earliest entries, from his very first month on the posting, read almost exactly like mine would have: brief, curious, faintly pleased notations about the strangeness of open water at night, the occasional distant fishing vessel, nothing that suggested a man on the edge of anything. It was only reading forward, month by month, year by year, watching the entries lengthen and the tone shift by degrees so gradual that no single page would have alarmed me on its own, that the full shape of what had happened to him became impossible to dismiss as simple isolation-induced imagination. I found, going back through several years of entries that first evening, a slow, unmistakable escalation in both frequency and specificity. Early entries, from his first year, noted maybe 1 or 2 lights observed a month, brief, clinical, unremarkable. By his 3rd year, the entries had become nearly nightly, and had started including a second recurring notation I didn't understand at first. A tally, in the margin, that grew steadily across each month before resetting, without explanation, at month's end. By his 6th year, his final year, the year just concluded before I arrived, the entries had grown longer, more anxious in tone even within Edmund's clipped, professional register, and the margin tally had climbed high enough in his final week that I did the math twice before believing it. 41. 41 lights observed in the final 7 days before my arrival, at a lighthouse 9 miles from the nearest other structure of any kind. His very last entry, dated the night before the supply boat brought him in to hand the post over to me, read simply, "They've started answering with the same count I log, the same night I log it, before I've even finished writing the number down. I don't know how they know. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this and staying the person who does it." I sat with that entry for a long time in the watch room, the tower's automated lamp turning steadily overhead, throwing its long beam out across water I could no longer entirely convince myself was as empty as it looked. I remember, specifically, closing the logbook, setting it back in its drawer and telling myself, with the particular firmness of someone trying to talk themselves into a feeling rather than actually possessing it, that 6 years alone on a rock like this would understandably wear on anyone's grip on ordinary explanation, that Edmund's careful, escalating record was more likely a document of a good man's slow psychological unraveling than any kind of genuine account of something real. I believed that, or told myself I believed it, for almost exactly one more night. Part 3. The first night. I did not sleep well that first night, though I want to be honest that at least some of that was ordinary. A new environment, an unfamiliar bed, the specific creak and groan of a 90-foot tower settling against wind and tide in ways my body hadn't yet learned to filter out as background noise. I woke a little after 2 in the morning to what I initially took for the automated foghorn cycling, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from somewhere out on the water rather than from the tower itself, and when I climbed up to the watch room to check the equipment, I found the foghorn silent, its mechanism idle, no fog in evidence at all under a clear, star-scattered sky. The sound continued anyway, faint, distant, unmistakably not mechanical in origin. A low, wavering tone that rose and fell in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of something between a foghorn and a human voice sustaining a single, mournful note. I scanned the water with the tower's spotting scope and found, perhaps half a mile out, 3 small points of light, arranged in a loose triangle, holding position on water that should have carried any actual vessel steadily along with the current rather than letting it sit still. I want to be honest about my state of mind in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. I did not, at 2 in the morning on my first night, immediately connect those lights to Edmund's logbook entries. I told myself, the way any reasonable person would, that I was looking at a fishing vessel running dark except for marker lights, holding position to work a net, and that the sound was some acoustic trick of open water carrying noise further than it had any right to travel. I logged it anyway, out of simple diligence, 3 lights, triangular formation, and I noted the time and I went back to bed, and I did not think about the lights observed column's disturbing tally until the following morning, when I checked my entry against Edmund's final week and found that his last logged night, the night before he left, had recorded in that same neat, anxious hand, an identical formation, 3 lights, triangular at almost exactly the same hour. The next night, the lights returned, and this time there were 5 of them. Part 4. The count. I want to describe the escalation over the following week as precisely as I can, because I think the precision itself is part of what made it so frightening. Not chaos, not randomness, but a steady, almost mathematical progression that felt, from the very beginning, like it was being calibrated specifically to me, the way a predator might calibrate its approach to a creature it had decided, for reasons of its own, was worth the patience of a slow and careful hunt. 3 lights the first night. 5 the second. The third night brought 7, arranged not in Edmund's earlier triangular pattern but in a rough line, holding position at what my rangefinder put at just under a quarter mile from the rocks, considerably closer than either of the previous nights. I began, by the 4th night, keeping a second private notebook alongside the tower's official log, because I found myself wanting a record that wasn't subject to whatever institutional skepticism might eventually meet Edmund's entries. A record I could trust as entirely my own observation rather than something that might later be dismissed as an isolated keeper's understandable but unreliable strain. The sound accompanying the lights grew clearer each night as well, and by the 5th night, I could no longer convincingly tell myself it was any kind of foghorn echo or acoustic trick. It was voices, not words, not anything I could transcribe, but unmistakably vocal in character, a low, layered chorus of tones that rose and fell together in something like unison. The way a group of people humming the same note might drift, occasionally, into something closer to harmony before settling back into unison again. I found myself standing at the watchroom window most of that 5th night, unable to look away, unable to convince my body to simply go back to bed and let the automated systems handle whatever needed handling, and it was only the tower's automated foghorn actually cycling on, startling me badly enough to break whatever hold that sound had settled over me. That got me moving again. I called the Trust's regional office the following morning, hoping, I think, for someone to simply tell me this was known, documented, manageable. Some previous keepers understood quirk of that specific stretch of water, fishing fleet behavior, anything with an ordinary explanation attached. Petra Voss, the coordinator I'd spoken with before taking the posting, listened to my account with a carefulness that unsettled me more than outright dismissal would have. "Keep logging it," she said finally. "Keep the light running on schedule. No interruptions, no matter what you see or hear. That's the most important thing. The light has to stay lit and it has to stay on its normal cycle. Can you promise me that?" I asked her, directly, whether this had happened to previous keepers, whether Edmund had reported something similar before he left. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped, before she answered carefully, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier professional warmth. "I can't discuss the specifics of a previous keeper's confidential reports," she said. "I can tell you that the light staying lit on schedule without interruption has never once failed to see a keeper through their posting safely. I need you to trust that, and I need you to promise me you'll keep it running no matter what." I promised her. I did not, at the time, fully understand what I was promising to hold the line against. Part 5. The Tide Pools. By the 8th night, the count had reached 19 small, steady lights, arranged now in a rough semicircle facing the tower directly, close enough that I could make out, through the spotting scope, shapes beneath each light that I did not want to look at closely enough to properly describe, low and pale and moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had nothing to do with any boat's motion on open water. The chorus of voices had grown loud enough, by that point, to be clearly audible even from inside the sealed watch room, and I had started sleeping or trying to sleep, with the room's small radio playing static at a volume just high enough to blur the worst of it into something less distinctly vocal. It was on the 9th night that I made the mistake Edmund had specifically warned me against on the dock, on my very first afternoon, in the one piece of advice I'd been arrogant enough to laugh at. I went down to the tide pools on the east side of the rock after the light was lit because I told myself, standing in the watchroom at nearly midnight, that I needed to actually see, at close range, whatever was gathering out there each night, that understanding it directly might be less frightening than continuing to watch it through a scope from a locked tower, growing by degrees each night with no explanation I could act on. I want to be honest that this reasoning felt, in the moment, considerably more rational than it reads now, describing it after the fact. The specific seductive logic of someone who has spent 8 straight nights being slowly worn down by an escalating dread that had started to feel, perversely, more bearable to confront directly than to keep enduring from a distance. The east side tide pools sat below a short, steep scramble down bare rock, exposed at low tide, and I reached them a little after midnight with a hand torch and a rope I'd tied off at the top of the scramble, more out of basic safety habit than any real expectation I'd need it. The climb down took longer than I'd anticipated, the rock slicker than it had looked from above, and I remember thinking halfway down that the chorus of voices from out on the water seemed to grow quieter the closer I got to the pools themselves, as though whatever was making that sound understood, in some way I couldn't articulate, that its audience had changed, that a different kind of attention was now required. The water in the pools themselves was still, unnaturally still given the wind and swell working the rest of the shoreline, and reflected in that stillness, impossibly, was the tower's own light, sweeping steadily overhead, except that the reflection, when I looked closely, was sweeping at a rate slightly out of sync with the actual lamp above me. A half-second delay that built, the longer I watched, into something that made my stomach drop with a specific, animal wrongness no amount of rational explanation could immediately smooth over. I crouched at the edge of the nearest pool, torch beam angled down into water that should have shown me nothing more than bare rock and the odd trapped crab, and instead showed me depth. Real depth, considerably more than any tide pool that size had any business containing. A darkness that seemed to recede the longer I stared into it. The way a held breath seems to stretch time the longer you refuse to let it go. Something moved in the pool nearest my feet. Not a fish, not a crab, nothing that belonged in a tide pool at all. A pale shape, roughly the size and general proportion of a human hand, pressed briefly against the underside of the water's surface from below, fingers splayed, before withdrawing into darkness too deep for that shallow pool to actually contain. I did not move for what felt like a very long time, torch beam still fixed on the spot where it had disappeared, some part of my mind cataloging, with a detachment that frightens me more in hindsight than the sighting itself, the precise, deliberate way those fingers had spread against the water's surface, not thrashing, not reaching in any panicked sense, but arranging themselves, almost gently, the way you might press your palm flat against a window to show someone on the other side that you were, in fact, still there. Something moved in the pool nearest my feet. Not a fish, not a crab, nothing that belonged in a tide pool at all. A pale shape, roughly the size and general proportion of a human hand, pressed briefly against the underside of the water's surface from below, fingers splayed, before withdrawing into darkness too deep for that shallow pool to actually contain. I ran. I'm not going to pretend there was anything more dignified or more deliberate about my retreat back up that scramble than simple animal panic, rope forgotten, torch beam wild, and I did not stop moving until I was back inside the tower with the door bolted behind me, and even then, for a long time, I stood with my back against that door, listening to the chorus outside grow louder, closer, more numerous than it had been on any previous night, as though my visit to those pools had been, itself, some kind of answer it had been waiting patiently for me to give. Part 6. What Petra Voss finally told me. I called the regional office again the next morning, and this time I did not accept a careful, evasive answer. I told Petra Voss exactly what I'd seen in that tide pool, exactly what the Count had climbed to, exactly how close the lights had come to shore, and I told her plainly that I wanted the full history of that posting, every keeper who'd served there, and what had actually happened to each of them before I was willing to spend one more night on that rock without understanding what I was actually being asked to hold the line against. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice that had finally shed the careful, institutional caution of our previous calls, she told me what she knew. Saltmere Light, she said, had been maintained by a human keeper year-round without interruption, for reasons that predated the current Maritime Trust's management entirely. Reasons documented, as far as anyone in the current administration could determine, only in a single sealed file from the original 19th-century Lighthouse Authority, a file she herself had only been permitted to read once, briefly, when she'd taken over her own coordinating role 11 years earlier. That file described the tower's light not simply as a navigational aid, but as what the original authority's own internal correspondence called a binding beacon, a light whose specific, unbroken nightly cycle served, according to notes she described as maddeningly nonspecific about mechanism while being entirely specific about consequence, to keep something offshore from approaching the coastline it otherwise, historically, had been documented approaching freely, with considerable loss of life before the tower was ever built. The light isn't really for ships anymore, she said. It never fully was. Modern automation could handle the navigational function without a keeper at all, and the Trust's board has asked, more than once over the decades, why we keep staffing a posting that redundant systems could technically cover. Every time, someone senior enough to have actually read that sealed file has quietly overruled the proposal, and none of them, as far as I've ever been told, has ever fully explained why in writing. I asked her how she'd come to actually believe any of this herself, given how carefully she'd guarded the information across every previous conversation we'd had. She was quiet for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice had dropped into something more personal than I'd heard from her before. My predecessor in this role left the same way keepers sometimes leave that posting, she said. Suddenly, without much explanation, citing reasons that didn't fully add up on paper. She sat me down before she left, much the way I imagine Edmund sat you down on that dock, and told me the things she felt she couldn't responsibly leave unsaid. I didn't believe most of it at the time. I've had 11 years since to slowly stop being able to dismiss it. I asked her directly what happened to keepers who couldn't maintain the cycle, what had happened specifically to Edmund Farrow, whose final logbook entry I now understood, with a clarity that made my hands shake holding the phone, considerably better than I had a week earlier. I don't know exactly what happened to him, she said, and I believed her, because I could hear, in her voice, the same specific fear I'd been carrying since that tide pool the night before. I know he requested relief 3 weeks earlier than his scheduled leave, which is unusual but not unheard of. I know his final psychiatric fitness assessment, filed the week before you arrived, described him as exhibiting what the examining physician called acute isolation-related anxiety with fixation on external stimuli, which is a clinical way of saying nobody wanted to write down that they believed him. And I know that 4 keepers before him, going back across the last 40 years of the Trust's records, requested similarly early relief under similarly vague circumstances, and that none of those 4, as far as I've been able to determine through records I probably shouldn't have access to, has ever been definitively located again after leaving that posting. Part 7. The 11th night. I made the decision, hearing that, to hold my post exactly as promised, rather than attempt an early relief request of my own, not out of any particular courage, but because Petra Voss made clear in that same call that an early relief request would take a minimum of several days to actually arrange transport, given the remoteness of the posting and the unpredictability of that stretch of water, and I did not believe, watching the Count climb the way it had over 8 nights, that several more days of escalation was a survivable wait regardless of which choice I made. I spent that same afternoon going back through Edmund's logbook one final time, searching for anything I might have missed on my first read, any hint of a method he'd used, even briefly, to slow or manage the escalation rather than simply enduring it. I found, tucked into the margin of an entry from his 4th year, A small, cramped note I'd overlooked entirely the first time through. Tried skipping a night's count once out of exhaustion. Woke to find the following night's tally had jumped by more than double what any single night had ever climbed before. Never skipped again. Better the steady climb than whatever punishes a missed one. I understood, reading that, exactly why he'd been so insistent standing on that dock, that logging every light was not simply good practice but something closer to the only genuine safeguard either of us actually had. The count on the 9th night, after my visit to the tide pools, had climbed to 31. The 10th night brought 38, close enough now that I could see, without the spotting scope, individual pale shapes beneath each light, arranged in that same patient semicircle, closer to shore than any previous night, close enough that the chorus of voices had become, by midnight, loud enough to feel less like sound and more like pressure, a physical weight against my chest that made simply breathing normally require conscious effort. The 11th night, the night the supply boat would later find me on the rocks below the tower, the count reached 47. I don't have a complete, coherent account of everything that happened that night, and I've decided, writing this, that I'm not going to manufacture false clarity where I genuinely don't have it, the same choice I've made in every account like this I've ever given. What I remember clearly is this. I had spent most of that evening at the watchroom window, logbook open beside me, hand shaking slightly as I recorded each new light joining the gathering formation, 42, 44, 46, the chorus outside no longer rising and falling in that earlier, almost gentle wave but holding, instead, at a single sustained pitch that seemed to vibrate up through the tower's own stonework, into the soles of my feet, into my teeth. The automated lamp mechanism, which had run without a single fault for 10 straight nights, failed at exactly 11:52 p.m., the beam simply stopping mid-rotation, and I remember the specific, sickening lurch of understanding, standing in that watchroom, that Edmund's very first piece of advice to me, win the mechanism by hand if the automation ever fails, don't wait for a service call, was not some ordinary operational contingency at all, but the single most important instruction he'd left me, arriving now on my 11th night, at the worst possible moment it could have arrived. I got the hand crank mechanism engaged within, I believe, under 2 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, the tower's beam resuming its steady sweep across water that had gone, in that brief interruption, entirely silent. No chorus, no visible lights at all, a stillness so complete and so sudden that it frightened me considerably more than the noise and the count ever had, because I understood, cranking that mechanism by hand, arm already burning with the effort, that something out there had been waiting patiently across 10 nights and a slowly climbing count, for exactly this specific kind of failure. I do not remember leaving the watchroom. I do not remember climbing down the tower's internal stairs, or crossing the rocks toward the east side. Though the supply boat crew who found me the following morning told me, gently, that I was discovered on the shoreline directly below the tide pools, soaked through, badly scraped along one arm and both knees, murmuring something none of them could fully make out over and over, in a rhythm one of the crew members later described to me, uneasily, as sounding less like distress and more like counting. Part 8. What's still out there? The supply boat had come in 3 days early, as it turned out, due to a scheduling change at the regional office that had nothing to do with my situation at all. An unrelated maintenance visit moved up, arriving, entirely by chance, at almost exactly the moment I needed it most. I have thought, more than a few times since, about what would have happened if that scheduling change had never occurred, whether the mechanism's failure that night would have simply repeated, uncorrected, on some future night when my luck or my strength or my understanding of Edmund's warning finally ran out. Saltmere Light has, as far as I know, been fully automated since my rescue, the human keeper posting formally suspended, pending what the Trust's public statement describes only as a review of staffing requirements in light of updated safety protocols. I don't know whether that suspension is permanent. I don't know whether it will hold. I've reached out to Petra Voss twice since my rescue, and both times she's responded carefully, professionally, declining to discuss specifics of an ongoing internal review. Though the second time, in a final line I don't think she meant to include, she wrote simply, "The light is still running on schedule. That's the only thing I can tell you that matters." I don't know what happened to Edmund Farrow. I have written to the address the Trust had on file for his emergency contact, a sister in a coastal town 200 miles from Saltmere, and received, after several weeks, a brief, careful reply confirming that she has not heard from him since the day he left that posting, that she has filed a missing persons report the local authorities have made, in her words, very little visible effort to actually investigate, and that she would appreciate anything further I could tell her, which I have not yet found the courage to fully provide, because I do not know what a grieving sister is supposed to do with an account like the one I've just given you. I think about that final logbook entry more than almost anything else from those 11 days. They've started answering with the same count I log, the same night I log it, before I've even finished writing the number down. And I think now that I understand what Edmund was actually describing in those final anxious weeks, better than I understood it reading it cold on my first afternoon. Whatever gathers off that coast each night is not simply responding to the light. It is responding to being counted, to being observed and recorded and acknowledged by whoever stands in that watch room keeping Edmund's meticulous, escalating tally, and I believe, though I cannot prove it any more than Edmund could, that the counting itself is part of whatever keeps it from coming further than the tide pools, a strange, unspoken arithmetic where the tower's light and a keeper's careful nightly attention are somehow, together, the actual mechanism holding a much older and much worse arrangement in place. If you ever find yourself offered an isolated posting, a lighthouse, a remote weather station, anything that comes with a sealed logbook and a predecessor too eager to leave the dock, read every entry before your first night, not your second or your third. And if that logbook asks you to count something, and keep counting it faithfully every single night without ever missing an entry, do exactly that without fail for as long as you're the one standing watch. I don't know what happens to the keepers who stop. I don't ever want to be the one who finds out.